Hello and welcome to our virtual broadcast of Improving Hanford EOC Responder Proficiency. It is presented by Jose Garcia, and Jose is an emergency preparedness specialist and the emergency management lead trainer with Mission Support Alliance LLC. He has more than 10 years experience at the Hanford site and more than 20 years experience as a first responder. If you have a question for Jose during the session, just put it in the chat box on your right, and I'll relay that to Jose at the end of the session. And with that, please join me in welcoming Jose Garcia to our virtual stage.
Welcome, everybody, to Improving the Hanford Emergency Operations Center Responder Proficiency. My name is Jose Garcia. I work for MSA, or Mission Support Alliance, here at the Hanford site. I'm an emergency preparedness specialist in the operations division. Like everybody else in our group, I do a little bit of everything to support the group as needed, when needed, but my primary duties include coordinating the emergency preparedness site-wide training. So here at the Hanford site, we're about 580 square miles of shrub steppe desert, and we border the Columbia River here in southeastern Washington. A little bit of history, beginning in about 1943, the site was used to produce plutonium that went into the bomb that helped end World War II. After a short lull, production was then again ramped up in about 1947 to meet the needs or the challenges of the Cold War. And we continued in production up until about 1987 when the last reactor ceased its operations. Now, unfortunately, the process for weapons production left us with both solid and liquid waste that poses a hazard to our local environment, including the Columbia River. So in about 1989, the U.S. Department of Energy, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and then the Washington State Department of Ecology entered into this legally binding accord that's known as the Tri-Party Agreement, with the goal of cleaning up the Hanford site. Now here at the site, we have our own fire department and our own protective force, which provides emergency services on a 24/7 basis to the site workers and also to the surrounding community through mutual aid. We do have about 22 high hazard facilities across the site. So here at the Emergency Operations Center, we're an emergency response facility, and it's maintained by DOE for the purposes of providing an area where personnel can convene to provide essential response functions. And some of those functions include on and off-site protective action recommendations, field monitoring and sampling, consequence assessment, employee and public information, and then oversight of Hanford-related mitigative actions and protective actions. We do have about 62 positions here at the Hanford Emergency Operations Center, which are staffed by approximately 236 volunteer personnel. So our requirements here are taken from DOE Order 151, the Comprehensive Emergency Management System. Hopefully most people are familiar with this order. And it talks about emergency response organization training and how ERO training must be provided initially, but also when there are significant changes to the training. Refresher training must also be provided no less than annually. And then finally, it talks about an assessment of the ERO members' proficiency at least annually. And in the guidance, the 151.1 guidance for the programmatic elements for training and drills talks about site level ERO. And it talks about initial training and annual training for the site level ERO. It also talks about refresher training, and then annually, or when hazards or procedures change, they need to have that refresher training. And again, it also talks about a demonstration of proficiency through testing and drills. And the guidance defines proficiency as a demonstrated skill and competency acquired from training and experience. So clearly, there's a difference between a training activity and demonstration of proficiency. So during one of our emergency management self-assessments for the Emergency Operations Center, we identified that our ERO personnel were receiving credit for annual refresher training by participating in an activity, whether that be an actual response, an exercise, a training activity, or a review of their position-specific procedure with the knowledge check at the end of that review. And then proficiency for EOC personnel was being demonstrated by an evaluation of the overall performance of the members participating in that exercise or that activity. And it was not tracked individually from the participation. So essentially, what we were doing is we were using our exercises, drills, our events for two purposes simultaneously, to give a member their annual refresher training, but also to grant them proficiency. Even though in the previous slides we just discussed that there's clearly should be a difference between the two activities. So we implemented some corrective actions in response to that assessment. And we decided that we wanted to clearly distinguish between training and proficiency, like is outlined in the order and in the guidance. We developed computer-based refresher training that incorporates both lessons learned and best practices from past events and exercises. And then we created a course number to formally track our participation in our EOC activities for the members. We created proficiency grading criteria for certain identified EOC positions, and we assigned a course number to those proficiencies as well so that we could track those separate from our EOC activity. And then we identified specific training requirements for our EOC instructors. And then finally, we revised all our training documents to better reflect our formal processes that we're putting in place due to these corrective actions. So who requires proficiency? Well, we did a review of the program elements as they related to the EOC operations responsibility for protection of our site workers, protection of the public, and protection of the environment. Okay? So not every position needs to demonstrate proficiency. Those who perform essentially the same function in the Emergency Operations Center as they do on a day-to-day basis don't require any additional specific training or proficiencies because they are considered proficient through their everyday work. But we did identify 13 positions that we are requiring additional proficiency evaluation for. Okay, and those positions are positions that have actions directly relating to essential response functions, or they may make decisions that affect emergency response. So some of these functions could include responsibilities such as emergency public information, off-site and on-site protective action recommendations, field monitoring and sampling, consequence assessment, and oversight of on-site mitigative activities, or oversight of, again, on-site protective actions. Okay. If there happens to be a failure in proficiency demonstration for these 13 positions, then we require that they do additional hands-on training until proficiency of their critical tasks can be demonstrated. So an example, a few examples of those critical positions, one would include our site emergency director. This person has the authority and responsibility for overall coordination and implementation of on-site emergency response activities and protective actions. Another position would be our Emergency Preparedness Advisor 1, and they provide emergency management expertise to the site management team. They're also responsible for updating our Hanford emergency notification forms, and they manage our Emergency Operations Center briefings. A third example would be our Public Information Director. This person has authority and responsibility to ensure accurate, timely emergency public information is approved and released by our Joint Information Center. So you can see these 13 positions have some pretty critical tasks that they need to be proficient at. These 13 positions, in addition to participating in an EOC activity, are required to also be evaluated for proficiency in a second activity or during a second activity. So some additional improvements that we implemented along the way, including making a requirement that all EOC personnel complete computer-based training. Again, there are some exceptions for those staff members that are designated subject matter expert, because what they do in their day-to-day job is essentially the same function they perform in the Emergency Operations Center. Okay. EOC personnel must also participate in an EOC activity annually, whether that be a response, exercise, position-specific review of their duties or checklist with a knowledge check. Okay. The 13 identified positions that we talked about in the previous slide must also show or demonstrate proficiency in addition to their EOC activity. Okay. And then each of our activities are tracked through the use of different course numbers. And this is for record-keeping purposes. So by assigning the course number, we're really taking advantage of our site training system that is already in place. So our training histories, our official records of proficiencies and training are maintained through that site training system. And this allows our EOC staff to use their database as a working file and not a records file. So in summary, really what we're trying to convey and what we've made strides at clearly or better clearly implementing is that we expect our entire Hanford site ERO to be proficient from top to bottom. So not just our facility level EROs, which they already have a good evaluation process in place. We've even implemented a proficiency process and evaluation for our Patrol Operations Center or our 911 Center. And then finally, we've better identified and clearly identified our expectations for proficiency at the Hanford Emergency Operations Center. So again, we're letting everyone know that our expectation is from top to bottom. We expect our ERO to be proficient, to be effective. And that's really the end of my presentation. Are there any questions at this time?
Jose, thank you so much for that informative and great presentation. We really appreciate the time you put into that. And I've been monitoring the chat for questions and haven't seen any come in just yet, but I wonder if you might have any closing comments that you might want to give us.
Yeah, so one closing comment, I would just remind some of the sites, I know we're different sizes, there's smaller sites, larger sites, and the larger sites by nature have a larger ERO or could have a larger ERO. If that's the case and we're limited on the amount of exercises we do, for example, we may do 2 evaluate exercises a year, but have 4 people that need proficiency. An option we have and we exercise is to create another limited scope activity for those members that didn't get to participate in the annual exercise. The key thing is that we do careful planning to ensure that we meet the objectives so that we can grade or judge proficiency on those ERO members by their critical tasks. So I'll just add that in there as a last minute word of advice.
That's great information. Thank you so much, Jose. Those of you who have attended today, be sure and check on the survey icon at the bottom of the screen and give Jose some feedback, and you'll also get credit there for attending the session. Also, if you're doing the scavenger hunt, I'm going to give you a tip, and there is an item you might want to check off on that. Our next session on this channel is accountability techniques with Thomas and CISO. You don't want to miss that, but if you do want to attend another session, just click it to the left in the schedule, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Jose. Appreciate you.